Hi everyone, I'm back and today we will be looking at a new subsection in marketing, which is supply and demand. Okay, now let's begin. So, supply and demand is a very important component in understanding marketing because, as you're well aware, or if we, go do a bit of a recap to our previous, videos, we have learned that marketing is a management task. It is a win-win situation where it provides products or services that is supposed to, attract customers, and by ensuring that these products and services meets the demand or meets the needs and wants of consumers. Hence, you have supply and demand, right? So a quick definition of what supply and demand means. There are two pictures here, and I'd like to show you many pictures as possible because I believe that pictures, well, they paint 1,000 words and more meaning to your understanding. So you have here picture 1 and picture 2. Picture 1 shows two individuals working in a market, right? And they're basically fishmongers and they're selling fish, right? And in picture 2, you also see a man, right, selling seafood, right? I believe it's also in a market. The difference here is that you also see an individual buying fish from the particular seller. So in a very quick description, let's see what they mean. The first picture shows about sellers or supply. Right, sellers, they will need to ensure that they have sufficient, in this category, enough fishes to be sold, all right, so that anyone will be able to purchase it at any particular time. So suppliers or sellers will need to make sure that the quantity of products or services are available for people to buy, right? At the same time, when you look at demand, it is defined by the quantity of customers, right? So these are all about customers who are willing and able to buy the product or service at a particular time. So as based on my explanation earlier about marketing, how businesses need to be able to meet the demand of customers, right? By giving them something they want, something they need. This links back to the word marketing objective. In order to ensure that the marketing objective is achieved, then there needs to be a good relationship between the supply and also the demand. All right, so let's look at the next part of this video, where we will look at supply and demand separately to have a better understanding. Okay, now the marketing objectives of a business will often be determined by the quantity or quality supplied and the amount demanded by customers. All right, so this is some of the key points: quantity supplied and the amount demanded by the customers in the marketplace. Right, so this basically means that to achieve a particular marketing objective, the business needs to ensure that the goods that they're trying to sell, well, there is a good amount of quantity available for purchase. And at the same time, there's also a good amount of people or customers who are willing and able to purchase those items. That makes the objective successful. All right. Now let's look further on the seller or supplier perspective first. Okay. Now, what really affects supply? Okay, so there are many factors here that we can talk about, whether indirect taxes, subsidies, changes in production costs, or technological changes. This will affect how much a seller is willing to supply or produce. Okay, take for instance weather, and a business or a person that produces rice, all right, and with bad weather, it would affect his or her supply in terms of how much rice he's able to produce because of the bad weather, right? So if it's a bad weather, then potentially the supply of rice that he will be able to produce would be lesser. All right, and how about changes in production costs? For example, there is an increase in terms of materials used in production of an item, right? Making it even costlier for a seller to produce those items, right? When there's an increase in price of materials, then the logical thing that you would think would be that seller would perhaps reduce the quantity supplied as well. Okay, so likewise, when there is a decrease in the production costs, making it cheaper for the seller to produce more. Okay, so these are some of the examples of factors that will influence supply. All right, now let's move on. You see two blank graphs on the screen right now, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit more about these factors influencing supply, some of the direct the direct factors, which would be the selling price, all right, and also the indirect factors such as, you know, weather and changes in production costs that may affect supply on the other graph. Okay, so let's look at the first graph first, and bear with me and my handwriting as I draw this graph for you. So if you have taken this in class before, then you know this would be something familiar to you. Let's look at this being price and this being quantity. Okay, so we're going to show you a seller graph, a seller or supply graph, right? So the price would be 2, 3. Okay, so this would be P1, P2, and P3. And this would be Q1, Q2, and Q3. All right. So generally, when we talk about selling price and sellers, if the price of a good is high, sellers tend to produce more of that particular good because, of course, they would tend to make more profits from selling these goods at a higher price. Right? So basically, if we were to, you know, connect the dots or create a supply curve, all right, here, the lower the price, the lower the quantity. The higher the price, the higher the quantity, and the highest price would result in the highest quantity produced. And if we were to connect these dots, all right, to create the supply curve, it will look like this. This being SO denotes the supply curve or the seller curve. All right, so essentially, the higher the price, the higher the quantity supplied. All right, this is a graph showing the connection between selling price and the quantity supplied by a particular seller. Okay, now on the other hand, let's look at other factors that may cause the supply curve to move or to change, all right, other than selling price. Okay, so let's use this graph over here, and let's make it a bit more colorful. I don't have much colors here, but let me just try and make it as creative for you as possible or colorful for you as possible, right? So now we have P1, we have P2, and we have P3, and we still have Q1, Q2, and Q3. All right, now let's put the original graph here as well, and to show you how the supply curve would move. Okay, so in the original graph it looked something like this. Let me, okay, 1, 2, 3, right? And this is SO, all right? So now the supply curve has a tendency to move, to increase or decrease depending on factors other than selling price. Okay, so the current diagram that you see here, the SO here, is the current standard diagram or standard supply curve based on selling price. But then how much a supplier is able to produce is also dependent on other factors, right? Take for example a bad weather. Now a bad weather would mean that the supplier would want to reduce, all right, or reduce the quantity supplied. It has nothing to do with selling price, but the quantity supplied will reduce because of bad weather. And when there is a decrease in supply, the shift or the supply curve would move, right, upwards. Okay, it would move upwards because when quantity is increasing, it moves to the right. But when it is decreasing, it will be going this way. So it will move up, right? And for that, the supply curve will now change, okay, will move up here, for example, right? And it becomes S1. Okay, now with this move of the curve, you would notice some changes, right? Now let's take note of these changes in terms of how the price of how the supplier would price this product now when the supply has been reduced. So in terms of, there's nothing in P1, right? But in P2, it's here, okay, and P3, it's here. Okay, so this shows, okay, at P2, at the price of P2, the quantity supplied is Q2, all right, it's lesser, okay. It's still expensive at P2 because it's lesser, it's the quantity supplied is lesser, but the quantity is reduced to Q2. But at P2, the quantity supplied is even lesser than Q1. All right. So this shows when the quantity supply decreases, all right, the price increases because of the reduced quantity supplied. All right. However, on the other hand, if we are talking about, the weather is good and the crops are, growing healthily, right, then you would see that the supply would increase. And when the supply increase, the supply curves shift downwards from SO to now S2. Okay, I'm just going to draw a quick line here, okay, and you will see that there is a difference now in terms of, what is the price and what is the quantity, okay, because the quantity supply, of course, is increasing and the price is between P1 and P2. Same goes here, right? As the quantity increases, all right, there is definitely an increase in price, so to speak. Okay, so it goes back to the same understanding where the selling price has an impact on quantity, but apart from the selling price itself, there are other factors, indirect factors, that may affect supply, like bad weather or increase in production costs, where the supply would be reduced, and when it reduces, the curve goes up. All right, when the supply increases, the curve goes down, and that will affect the price that the supplier will set, right, to be sold, right, in order for them to make money as sellers. Now, I don't know if you're able to follow very well on this slide. My drawing is not very good, but I hope you were able to pick up a thing or two so far for the supply portion. Okay, now let's move on to the next part where we look at demand. Now, we'll still do a recap here on marketing objectives because it's talking about supply and demand, right? Having a good amount of products available to be purchased and having a good amount of people or customers who are able to buy or demand for the particular product, right? So we'll look at demand in detail right now. What really influences demand? So this affects customers. So what people like you and me to buy a particular product, right? We will look at prices of similar products. We will look at how much money we have. We will look at, you know, our own attitudes and preference on a particular goods. We will look at all the seasonal factors, whether what is hot, what is not, right? We'll also look at, you know, our age group, how old we are and what, you know, background do we come from and things like that. And we'll also look at advertising, you know, if there's a lot of advertising going on a particular product every single day on our Facebook, on our phones, or through WhatsApp and whatnot, that may attract us to buy certain products and services. So generally, the factors that affect demand would have a reaction on customers on whether they will purchase more or purchase less of a particular product. So we look at the purchasing ability, right? The want and also able to purchase the product. That affects the demand. Okay, so similarly like before, we have two blank graphs here, and now we're going to talk about demand graph. Okay, so we're going to talk about selling price first and how it affects demand. So if a price of a good is high or a price of good is low, how will that affect demand, right? So the same graph I'm going to do here with P1, P2, P3, Q1, Q2, Q3. Yeah, so 1, 2, 3, and this is price. Okay, and this is quantity, and this is Q1, Q2, and Q3. So the idea between selling price and demand is that as customers, we tend to buy items more if that item is priced low. All right, and we tend to buy less if that item is priced high. Okay, so with the idea of low price, high quantity, we are looking at a low price of, wait, I did not label the price here, so it's P1, P2, P3. So P1 being the lowest priced here, then generally it would mean that Q3 is the demand or quantity demanded by customers being the lower price, right? At P2 it will be Q2, and at P3 being the highest price would look at the lowest quantity demanded. And now if I bring the dots together, I'm able to create the demand curve at D0. Okay, so essentially the price affects how much we buy certain things. This is a general guideline, right? The highly priced the product is, the lesser the quantity demanded, and so forth, right? But now we're going to look at the other blank graph on the other side to talk about what are the other factors that will affect the demand, all right, or of how we look at things and how much we will buy besides the selling price itself. Okay, now let's look at advertising. Okay, so before we look at advertising, let me do the let me fill up the this blank graph with price and quantity. Okay, and you have P1, P2, P3, and Q1, Q2, and Q3. So I'm going to do the same thing just to show you the movement of the shift of the demand curve. Okay, so when I connect the dots, this is DO. Okay, now what will cause the demand curve to move? All right, for example, the demand of a particular product may be impacted by consumer income. Well, now when we have more money, all right, we tend to buy more of certain things. Therefore, the demand will increase. All right, when the demand increases, the demand curve will increase this way, will move upward, right? And so the demand curve will now be somewhere in this line, okay, to D1. Okay, so now what happens in D1? Let's do some, checking in terms of the price and whatnot. Due to increase in demand, the price of the product, okay, as you can see, the quantity demanded for the product has increased, okay, because of there is more money to spend. Okay, in terms of price, okay, the initial price at P3 we have Q1, all right, but now with an increase of money, they have more money to spend, and this has increased demand. At P3, people are buying at Q2, as you can see here, all right, and at Q3, okay, right, at P2, people are buying at Q3. So it shows that with the increase of income, people are willing to pay slightly higher prices because they have more money to spend, right? On the same note, let's look at what happens when there is a decrease in demand. Okay, because times are bad, right? People are losing jobs, as in terms of what's happening right now as well all over the world, right? Now when there is a decrease in demand because they don't have much money to spend, then the demand curve will move from DO, it will move inward, right? We'll go inward, and there you go. We'll just draw another line here like that, okay, and this becomes D2. Okay, and let's look at the prices and the quantity, the correspondent quantity. Okay, now at Q1, okay, the price is now at P2. Okay, Q2 at P1. So at P2 now, people are, the quantity that they have purchased is reduced to Q1. Okay, and at the same time at P1, people are willing to buy up to Q2. Okay, so you see, due to the decrease in demand, the price is also, of course, slightly expensive as well. Okay, but this has also affected the demand of how much people are willing to pay. All right, the amount has been reduced because of lack of income, right? And therefore, as we look at it, the price is also, how much they're willing to pay has also reduced. Yeah, so this shows you a bit of a description between selling price and this one here, selling price, diagram 1, selling price and quantity demanded, right? And on diagram 2, it shows you or explains to you about how much demand is affected by other factors apart from price. Okay, the movement of the graph goes upward when there is an increase in demand because quantity will increase, and also the prices that people are willing to pay, right, when the quantity they are willing to buy is higher and is affected by consumer income. And when they have lesser amount of money, the quantity is reduced from and is reduced, and the price is also affected, right? The price of how much they're willing to pay is also affected. Okay, so that sums up the supply and demand separately. The next part of this video is about putting the supply and demand curve together, all right, in order for the market to determine the right price where there is no excess in terms of supply produced and demand left unfulfilled. Okay, let's look at that in the next slide. Okay, so we're not done so far about supply and demand. We're still in supply and demand, but now we're going to look at how they interact, right? The interactions between price, supply, and demand. So what's going to happen is that we're going to put the supply curve, the demand curve on a same graph. We're going to see how they interact with price, right? Because it's important to, determine what is the ideal pricing to set where it's comfortable for the suppliers to produce and it's also comfortable for the customers to afford or to purchase, all right? So before we proceed, I need to, prepare this graph again for you, and let me do this. 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4. Okay, now to do this, as we have learned earlier, let's talk about the supply curve first. Wait, my graph is not really complete because I did not label it. This would be price and this would be quantity, and basically P1, P2, P3 and P4, Q1, Q2, Q3 and Q4. Okay, so based on what we've learned about the supply curve, it has a positive reaction with price. What it means is that when the selling price is high, sellers tend to produce more of it because, well, they'll be making more money when the selling price is high. Yeah. So with that idea, P4 being the highest price will produce Q4, P3, Q3, P2, Q2, and P1, Q1. And when we connect this line together, we have the supply curve. Okay. Now, apart from that, we'll also be looking at the demand curve. And the demand curve is such where we are going to look at how price and demand reacts, right? So as customers, we would be willing to pay more when the price is the lowest or the cheapest, right? So at P1, it will be Q4, P2 at Q3, P3 at Q2, and P4 at Q1. Okay, so connecting this line here, it looks something like this, which is the demand curve. As you can see, based on the demand curve and the supply curve, there is a point where they interact, right? And that point of interaction is here. Okay. Now at this point of interaction, let's look at the corresponding price and quantity. Okay. In this case, it is here and here. So this is the price between P2 and P3 and the quantity between Q2 and Q3 that both sellers and buyers are comfortable with. In other words, a supplier who will produce a quantity between Q2 and Q3 for a selling price between P2 and P3 for customers who are also willing to purchase at the same price and the same quantity. What does that mean? There is no wastage, right? That is a very ideal market situation where whatever is produced by the sellers is bought completely by the customers at the corresponding price and quantity as shown in the graph. Okay, so what happens when it goes above this equilibrium? We call this EQ, yeah, or equilibrium, the point where the supply equals the demand for a product and there is no waste. All right, now let's look at what happens above the equilibrium. Right, above the equilibrium, let's just draw a line here to just have a bit of understanding. Okay, we see the 2 points of the supply and the demand here. All right, at above equilibrium, we find that in terms of demand, okay, in terms of demand, the quantity demanded is at Q2, for example, but the quantity supplied is at Q3. As you can see, these 2 points over here. Okay, these 2 points, right? So demanded is lesser, supplied is more. So there would be wastage in terms of supply, because customers are only willing to purchase at a lesser amount, although at the same price but at a lesser amount. So suppliers will be facing wastages, right? What happens below this equilibrium as well? Let's draw another line at the bottom. Okay, and let's say just below the equilibrium, let's look at P2. Okay, P2 over here. All right, now at P2, if you look at the demand curve, the demand here is at Q3. People are looking at Q3, they want to buy at Q3, okay, willing to buy at Q3, and as suppliers, they are only able to produce at Q2. Okay, so below equilibrium, there is excess in demand. Okay, all right, and above equilibrium, there is excess in supply. All right, therefore, an ideal market situation would be the one as denoted in EQ, as you see in this current slide. Okay, where both suppliers and buyers, all right, or customers are happy because the quantity demanded is available by the suppliers for the buyers to buy. All right, so this is basically the interactions between price, supply, and demand. Now, this is a slide where we summarize what we have learned, and some of the key takeaways is that you should be able to define demand and supply by themselves and then connect them in terms of the relationship between demand and supply and how demand and supply is related to marketing. Apart from that, perhaps you have concerns about whether or not you will need to draw graphs in the exam. Well, you do not need to draw graphs actually, but understanding the way demand and supply works gives you a bit more rationale, all right, a logical understanding. Hence, the graphical diagram was drawn today in a not very pretty way, but hopefully you're able to, still follow and see the logic behind what has been drawn. Okay, but again, to emphasize that you will never be required to actually draw a graph in the exam itself. Yeah, okay. We have come to the end of today's lesson. Today's lesson is a bit long, it's about half an hour. It is because I spent a lot of time drawing graphs and trying to explain a bit more with my drawings. I'm not too sure if you're able to follow, and I apologize if it's too hard for you to understand. But if you have any questions and concerns, my email address is on this slide here, teach@savage.com.my. Feel free to write to share your feedback, comments, and don't forget to share and subscribe to this channel. Share it with your friends, put in some likes where you can, and I'll see you again when my next video is ready. Thank you and have a great day ahead.